Welcome to another episode of the History of Yu-Gi-Oh! As always, we're looking at the history of the meta and popular playstyles during different time periods. In today's episode, we're diving into the years of 2014 and 2015, and beginning with the post-Dragon Ruler Dominance format. As mentioned in the last video, the January 2014 ban list was able to kill the remaining power of Ravine rulers. This was done through the forbidding of Return from a Different Dimension, Sixth Sense, and Dragon Ravine. In addition, Sacred Sword of 7 Stars and all 4 Dragon Rulers were finally limited, as well as Spellbook of Fate, to make sure spellbooks didn't have a major comeback after weakening Dragon Rulers a lot. However, the ban list also allowed a key card to come back for another deck, Fire Formation TENKI. You can pretty much guess which archetype was the new #1 deck in the following format. The new era was ruled by Fire Fists, and it was named +1 Fire Fists due to how easy it was for the deck to continuously keep going +1 or more from each of their cards. It also helped the deck that its slightly older card, Rekindling, was able to work so well with the deck. This allowed for massive graveyard revival, which would then allow for either large amounts of extra deck plays or simply going for the win the same turn with all those attacks. The two main cards for Rekindling were Brotherhood of the Fire Fist Spirit and Brotherhood of the Fire Fist Leopard. It was really important because Spirit was the deck's main tuner, but it was also limited, so Rekindling was able to provide consistent recursion for it to be used over and over and over again. This, in combination with constant +1s as well as monster removal, allowed Fire Fist to make a major impact in the format. There were a couple of other prominent decks, however, with some still lingering from before the Dragon Ruler format, such as Mermails and Yugioh. There were also some new ones though, with the major ones being Harpies, Boojans, and the return of Infernoids way back since the 5Ds era. Mermails did have Atlantean Dragoons limited, but they still had very powerful potential in the OTK build, especially with Title's help, and so they were prominent contenders against Fire Fists. The reason why these decks also work so well is because the Dragon Rulers were each limited, and despite them not having a solidified deck anymore, the Dragon Rulers themselves were easily splashable onto archetypes that use a specific attribute. Fire Fist utilized Blaster, Mermails took advantage of Title, Harpies constantly relied on Tempest, and Yugioh's looked for Redox's power. And the truth was that these Dragon Rulers did still provide a large boost to their respective decks, so they were still very relevant individually. Although Yugiohs were very powerful due to the help from Redox, the other even more major factor was the release of their very own Yugioh structure deck in late 2013. It had already been out for several months, but Ravine Rulers forced Yugiohs to be largely irrelevant, even with this structure deck. In addition, Yugioh, a multi-special summon from the deck card which was also released way back in Lord of Tachyon Galaxy, was incredibly powerful. All of this was able to make Yugioh a very fast archetype that could occasionally make it to the top in tournament play. Harpies performed similarly well, and for several reasons. Their field spell was actually pretty useful during this time, because the meta was very trap heavy ever since priority was removed a while back, which I mentioned in the last video of course. The spell card wasn't really that good before this because Harpies had no inherent way to spam special summoning for their archetype. However, support since Lord of Tachyon Galaxy in 2013, such as Harpy Channeler, were very helpful in boosting up the deck's special summoning potential and consistency. This, in combination with powerful Rank 4 Xyz monsters that were specific to their deck, such as Harpy's Pet Phantasmal Dragon, Lightning Shidori, and Ice Beast Zerofine, were truly magnificent. As you can see, none of these are generic Rank 4s, and really only Harpy decks were able to capitalize on these. Lightning Shidori had non-destruction removal spinning, which is much better than bouncing. Zerofine had fantastic mass negation, which is actually still a good effect in today's game, and Phantasmal Dragon had solid protection and the ability to potentially sneak in that last hit for the win. All of this, in combination with Tempest still being limited, allowed them to be a very powerful deck. The last two were Boojin and Infernoids. Boojin decks were a bit slower but relied on powerful monsters. The deck revolved around their main monster Boojin Yamato to continuously get advantage while having hand trap protection from Boojin Ukraine and Honest. Infernoids on the other hand relied on getting a new Xyz monster out, Lavalval Chain. Players today recognize this card as that one card that got forbidden because it had a once per turn Foolish Burial effect. Infernities, however, were one of the few decks in Yu-Gi-Oh's history that could also take advantage of its other effect instead, and that is to stack a card on top of your deck. You see, Infernity's key card, Infernity Archfiend, greatly benefited from being drawn while you have no other cards on hand. And so if you could constantly get this card to the top of your deck, the deck could really get going fast due to special summoning and then fetching an Infernity spell or trap card, which you could then use right away because you had no cards on hand. As the year went on, some players tried to use the Dragon Rulers as an engine with the hieratic cards, and it saw some success, but Fire Fists and Mermails were definitely the best in the format. In April, the ban list limited the popular Coach Soldier Wolfbark and Rekindling for Fire Fists, Mermail Abyssgundia for Mermails, Infernity Barrier for Infernities, and even Hieratic Seal of Convocation for Hieratics to lower Dragon Ruler's consistency because Konami seriously feared of seeing a new powerful Dragon Ruler deck. This ban list resulted in Yugioh mostly dominating the next format, but Konami's fear also came true, because the Yu-Gi-Oh community discovered a new Dragon Ruler deck, Mythic Rulers. This deck relied on Mythic Water Dragon and Mythic Tree Dragon. You see, normal summoning Tree Dragon allows you to special summon Water Dragon, which then allows you to change Tree Dragon to level 8. This deck also ran White Stone of Legend along with Dragon Ruler support, Blue Eyes White Dragon, and Trade-In, and it was a very consistent rank 8 engine, with cards like Divine Dragon Knight Felgrand and Hieratic Sun Dragon Overlord of Heliopolis constantly hitting the field in this deck. The reason for this deck's success, however, was due to one more card recently released in April, Soul Charge. Remember those cards like Dimension Fusion and Return from a Different Dimension that would constantly hit the ban list throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history? Well, this card is basically those, except it mass summons from the graveyard. And if Konami thought the ones that mass summoned from the Banish Zone were broken, nobody knows why on earth they ever printed this card. Seriously. Dragon Rulers were by no means the only deck to capitalize on Soul Charge, but they were one of the most popular for sure. In May, the new Artifact archetype was released, which were mostly comprised of monsters that could also be set in the back row. They also had a powerful disruptor, Artifact Sanctum. The archetype never really functioned as their own dedicated deck, but these cards were very splashable onto other decks to emit fear of back row from the opponent even more. Out of all the decks, the deck that used them the most wasn't actually an archetype, but it was the famous Hat deck, which means Hand Artifact Trap Tricks. This deck used the stupidly annoying Fire Hand and Ice Hand cards that would just not go away, as well as artifact cards and the iconic Trap Tricks Mermello. In June, we received another new structure deck, Realm of Light. And this deck saw the return of Lightsworns to the competitive formats. You see, the overall reason why Lightsworns were slowly phased out throughout the years is because Lightsworns only mill during the end phase. And as you know, milling is how Lightsworn decks are able to effectively go off. This naturally made them too slow for newer formats. However, what if we received a Lightsworn that didn't have to wait until the end phase? What would that do to the deck? The answer is quite a lot actually. And we saw that through the release of Raiden, Hand of the Lightsworn, a Lightsworn that can mill on the spot, which was also a tuner. This structure deck combined with Dragon Rulers in the mix to make the iconic Lightsworn Rulers deck. The combo revolved around banishing Eclipse Wyvern from the Dragon Rulers effect to reliably get Judgment Dragon into the hand to then nuke the board. This format stayed throughout the summer, with July's ban list limiting Gear, but nothing else really too major. The following month in August, however, Duelist Alliance was released, and this set brought a monumental shift in the game's meta due to the new Pendulum summoning mechanic. This new era in Yu-Gi-Oh would see a lot more decks that focus on Synchro and XD summoning of course, but also marked a quite notable return of fusion and ritual based decks. As the game slowly shifted from the post-XC's era to the Pendulum era, the game sped up tremendously again. Before I get to the cards and archetypes that dominated the rest of 2014, I have to explain Master Rule 3, which was released alongside Duelist Alliance. Master Rule 3 is perhaps the most game-changing Master Rule among all of Yu-Gi-Oh's Master Rules, with a whopping 6 changes to Yu-Gi-Oh! The first change is the new field layout, which introduced Pendulum Zones, Pendulum Monsters, Pendulum Scales, and Pendulum Summons. The second is the introduction of problem-solving card text, which serves the purpose of cleaning unnecessary text in all cards released from this point on, including any reprints of older cards. The third is the removal of the first player turn draw. Previously, the player who goes first would also basically start with 6 cards in their hand, but now it was only 5 cards. The fourth and fifth are 2 changes to how field spells work. Now each player can have a field spell on their side, and also field spells are no longer destroyed when replaced by a new field spell, but instead they're simply sent to the graveyard. This was to stop some crazy powerful loops such as Gear Town. And the 6th was the simplifying of the damage step during the battle phase into 5 different timings as opposed to more. As far as archetypes, Duelist Alliance introduced 3 new archetypes into the TCG: SHADDOLL, Burning Abyss, and SATELLARKNIGHTS. Among the 3, it was quite clear that Shaddolls were the strongest. Shaddolls were a series of flip monsters that outside of their flip effect also had an extra effect which usually involved the graveyard, and they had their stronger El Shaddol fusion counterparts. The funny thing is, if hypothetically you told Yu-Gi-Oh players in early 2014 that later in 2014 an archetype made up of flip effect monsters that relied on fusion summoning would destroy the meta that year, honestly, everyone would just laugh at your face and wonder if you hit your head on something. Because on surface level, yes, it sounds completely ridiculous. But there are 2 primary reasons why the archetype was that great. The first is their fusion spell. And I'm not talking about polymerization, I'm talking about Shaddol Fusion, an archetype-specific fusion card that allowed you to fusion summon materials straight from your deck as long as the opponent controlled an extra deck monster. This was incredibly unique and worked well against basically every single deck at the time, because there were no decks not utilizing the extra deck during this time. And before you try to get smart by saying, well, I'll just duel against Shaddolls by playing no extra deck, that'll teach them. Yeah, go ahead and try that in 2014 and really tell me how successful you were at winning. It's not going to work. So basically, either way, players were screwed as there was no effective counters against Shaddolls. However, there's also a second reason why Shaddolls were so good. Let's say you were ridiculous enough to run Curse Seal the Forbidden Spell and somehow successfully used it on the Shaddol Fusion to ban it for the whole duel. By the way, this never happened, but let's get hypothetical. You would be so disappointed to see that next turn, your opponent just drops the Super Polymerization and uses your monster as a fusion material. Yep, this was honestly around the time when fusion monsters were starting to be less specific and more generic in materials, which meant that it was much more likely that an opponent had a valid material for your fusion monster. Let's take El Shaddol Construct as an example. Its materials are 1 light monster and 1 Shaddol. This means that if your opponent has any light monster in the game, that's a valid target for Super Poly. And the funny thing is that as more sets were released, Konami continued to release El Shaddol fusion monsters that require different attributes as materials. So as long as you just put 1 of each in your extra deck, it doesn't matter what monster your opponent has in the field, as you're guaranteed it's one of the 6. Unless, your opponent has a Winged Dragon of Ra, which is Divine Attribute, in which case you're screwed because we all know how broken that card is, right? Anyway, the point is, Shaddolls were crazy powerful during this time. Moving on to Burning Abyss, the deck was powerful because of the previously old card Tour Guide from the Underworld, which was a great level 3 Fiend support card. And guess what most Burning Abyss cards were? That's right, level 3 Fiends. Burning Abyss monsters also had effects that trigger when they were sent to the graveyard, and many variants of this deck ran traps discarded, like Karma Cut or Phoenix Wing Windblast, to get an extra effect from the Burning Abyss discarded. Their other reason for their power was Dante, Traveler of the Burning Abyss, a card that could self-mill to trigger more Burning Abyss effects, buff up its attack, and even had built-in recursion. The third deck was SATELLARKNIGHT. Their main extra deck monster was SATELLARKNIGHT Delteros, which wasn't as powerful nor as easy to summon as Dante, but SATELLARKNIGHTs had an advantage over Burning Abyss in that they had easy access to the quickly expanding Reign 4 Xyz monsters and engine, while Burning Abyss had to rely on 3s, an engine that wasn't nearly as powerful as 4 anymore. It only kept getting bigger and stronger with cards like number 101 Silent Honor Arc, Exciton Knight, Abyss Dweller, Lavalwa Chain, and Castel the Skyblast Musketeer. Overall, the advantages between Burning Abyss and SATELLARKNIGHTs offset each other quite well and were on an even playing field, with Shaddolls being at the top of both. The October ban list limited Infernity Archfiend, Soul Charge, and Super Polymerization, which really focused more so on older decks with only a minor hit to Shaddolls, but they were still at the top for another month. In November, however, the new Challengers released yet another new archetype, the Qliphort cards. This was the first competitive deck to implement Pendulum Summoning heavily. The goal of the deck was simple: swarm the deck using Pendulum Summoning so your monsters could be tributed for stronger Qliphort monsters, such as the infamous APOOLIPHORT Towers. Now, I will say that APOOLIPHORT Towers didn't see consistent play in this deck yet. That won't be until 2015, but the deck was still very strong. Either way, I'll talk about Towers now. This card was immune to all spell and trap effects, as well as monster effects who had a level or rank lower than it, which means 9 or less, which is basically like 99% of meta-relevant monsters. This means there's only 2 ways to get rid of it, either by battle, which by the way has 3000 attack, or by tributing it somehow. And that's its entire effect. Crazy, right? I'm just kidding, yeah. Seriously though, you would have probably believed me if you had never heard of this card, because that alone is already ridiculous. But get this, it also made all special summon monsters lose 500 attack and defense, which made it even more impossible to destroy by battle. And once per turn, you can make your opponent get rid of a monster from their hand or field. What the heck? This was honestly one of the earlier cards in the game that would set the foundation for how Yu-Gi-Oh is today regarding boss monsters. You know how you constantly hear things like, oh, if your boss monster doesn't have a million negates and isn't immune to everything, then it sucks. Yeah, basically that translates to, if your boss monster isn't like Qliphort Towers, then it sucks. It's funny saying this, but also a little sad in seeing that Yu-Gi-Oh has come to this. Moving into the January 2015 ban list, Super Polymerization got forbidden, which really cut the power of Shaddolls to compete with Qliphort decks. It also banned Artifact Moraltech, a card that was seeing lots of play in Shaddolls as the material for El Shaddol Construct, one of their key cards. Lastly, this new ban list also saw one of the dumbest things Konami ever did. They unbanned Snatch Steel. What? So what happened? Short answer is, nobody played it. Yeah, right. Every single Yu-Gi-Oh player and their grandma ran this in literally every single deck, to the point where it was absolutely insane and ridiculous. So obviously the card got banned on the next format. Anyway, in February, the Secret Forces were released, which released a Ritual archetype, which was very different than past Ritual decks. It was actually super consistent. The two main cards were Nekroz of Qliphort and Nekroz of BRIONAC. And if you look at their effects, this is exactly why this deck was good. They're ritual monsters, but their effects aren't exclusive to them having to be on the field. You can discard them for good searching effects. This coupled really well with solid support cards and Shurit, Strategist of the Nekroz, as well as the older Jin Releaser of Rituals, the latter which can be used as a material from the graveyard, as well as prohibiting the opponent from special summoning as long as that ritual summon monster is on the field. This would be called the Jin lock, which was exceptionally easy to perform. XC summon Labalbal Chain, send Jin to the graveyard from the deck with its effect, and ritual summon Qliphort in defense mode using Jin as the full material, because it's 3 levels. 2300 defense while prohibiting special summoning was not easy to clear, especially when other Nekroz cards could further protect Qliphort from destruction. This lock would go on to destroy the format for most of 2015, because the other power decks making a breakthrough couldn't compete with it. Some examples were Ritual Beast decks which use Ritual Beast Ulticanahawk for massive loops, or Mask Heroes introduced by the Hero Strike structure deck, which brought us Mask Hero Dark Law and Elemental Hero Shadow Mist. These decks were both very powerful in the control aspect, but they couldn't completely compete with the Jin loop all the way, because they still needed to special summon. In April 2015, Nekroz decks received a limit on preparation of rites and semi-limited Nekroz of BRIONAC, which only did minor damage to the Jin lock, but Jin itself was not hit. And Assault on other players' wounds arrived when Tour Guide, Skill Drain, and Vanity's Emptiness got limited. Yes, the latter two are powerful floodgates, but they saw much more play in Qliphort decks and other decks as well, and so this only hurt them and not really Nekroz that much, because Nekroz relied on Jin, which wasn't hurt. Also, the Dragon Rulers were finally forbidden due to their constant splashable effectiveness and also the momentum that number 95 Galaxy Eyes Dark Matter Dragon was having from Dragon Ruler support. But in July, Nekroz was finally hit. Jin and Labalbal were finally forbidden. And in August, Clash of Rebellions released the Performage monsters, including Trick Clown, Hat Tricker, and Damage Juggler. These were splashable light Ring 4 engine support cards that saw lots of play in Shaddol decks and newer variants of Nekroz as well. However, the card Wavering Eyes was also released, which gave Qliphort decks a huge boost because now they could easily search towers through the destruction of Scout, and it became borderline busted. And this is when Qliphort decks started to consistently bring out this brutal card. This very unhealthy format stayed until the November 2015 ban list, which is known as one of the craziest format reset ban lists ever. Here's why. All the following cards got forbidden: Shurit, El Shaddol Construct, Qliphort Towers, and Exciton Knight. The following got limited: BRIONAC, Unicorn, Shaddol Fusion, Mathematician, Qliphort Scout, Graph, Ulticanahawk, and Rhoda. This basically destroyed everything in the meta. So what happened? Well, the release of Dimensions of Chaos released even more archetypes, Majespecters, Cosmos, and it also strengthened Performage decks with more support. Performage decks got buffed up because of powerful support cards like Luster Pendulum and Archfiend Eccentric, alongside the potential power of Plushfire. And together they were all over the place in the extra deck, with going into fusions for Gem Knight Seraphonite with Brilliant Fusion, going into the Xyz pool for King of the Feral Imps, which could search Palomuro, and then going into synchros with Naturia Beast. Yes, it seriously went all over the place, and you could easily get cards like Damage Juggler and Tricklon into the graveyard while receiving an extra normal summon from Seraphonite. I know it's hard to believe, but yes, this deck could literally do all of this, and it was only the beginning of its power because it developed into an even stronger deck in early 2016, but that's for the next video. The other two decks were Cosmo and Majespecters. Cosmo decks got a new release in Dark Destroyer, a powerful boss monster, and Majespecters were another Pendulum archetype. But both archetypes had lots of cards with targeting and destruction immunity, and both of these decks would guide the TCG into steering away from cards that simply target or destroy, because most boss monsters by this point started to become a lot more immune to that. By the time November came around, mass hero decks were more popular because Dark Law was able to counter Pendulum decks quite well, and then the new INFERNOID cards ended up getting Reasoning banned because every single INFERNOID monster in the deck could not be normal summon or set except DECATRON, which meant a player could just activate Reasoning and mill literally their entire deck until DECATRON was activated, which was super hilarious and ridiculous. And the very last deck of 2015 was Pendulum Magicians, which used mostly unrestricted pendulum scales to allow Odd Eyes Pendulum Dragon or Mist Valley Apex Avian to see play with the help of Wisdom Eye Magician and Dragon Pulse Magician. And that's about where 2015 comes to a close. It's a little insane how fast the game sped up within 2 years, and it was seriously only the beginning, with the next 2 years belonging to numerous infamously broken decks in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Want to know more about the continuation of the Pendulum era? Like, subscribe, comment, and turn on those notifications as the next video comes out.